When George Patton crossed the Rhine without permission, he didn't just break orders, he broke the rules of command. Behind closed doors, General Omar Bradley was furious, conflicted, and afraid. Because if Patton failed, the war could collapse. And if he succeeded, history would never forgive the disobedience. The Rhine River was supposed to be the final wall. For the German High Command, it was the last natural barrier that could slow the Allied flood pouring into the heart of the Reich. 4. The Allied Supreme Command. It was a line that had to be crossed carefully, deliberately, and with overwhelming preparation. Bridges were to be secured, airborne forces coordinated, artillery positioned, and commanders synchronized like gears in a giant machine. No mistakes, no improvisation, no risks. That was the plan. And then George S. Patton crossed it anyway. On the night of March 22, 1945, while most of the Allied command structure believed the Rhine crossing was still days away from being fully organized, Patton's Third Army slipped across near Oppenheim almost quietly. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic press release, just engineers, infantrymen, tanks, and Patton himself, standing on the east bank before anyone at headquarters fully grasped what had happened. By the time the news reached senior commanders, it was already irreversible. The line had been broken. The war had entered its final act. Omar Bradley was not a man given to theatrics. Known as the GI's general, Bradley believed in discipline, coordination, and restraint. Where Patton burned hot and loud, Bradley remained calm, methodical, and deeply conscious of responsibility. He was not opposed to boldness, but only when it served the plan. That night, when the reports crossed his desk, Bradley understood instantly that Patton had once again acted first and informed later. And once again, history would have to decide whether it was recklessness or genius. The relationship between Bradley and Patton had always been complicated. They had trained together, fought together, and risen through the ranks side by side. But they could not have been more different in temperament. Bradley believed wars were won by coordination and cooperation. Patton believed wars were won by speed, shock, and audacity. Their philosophies collided constantly, yet somehow, together, they formed a balance that drove the Allied armies forward. As Bradley read the initial reports from Third Army headquarters, there was disbelief, then irritation, and finally a quiet realization. Patton had crossed the Rhine without waiting for formal authorization. He had done exactly what he had always done, seen an opportunity and seized it. Consequences be damned. Bradley knew what this meant. If Patton failed, the blame would land squarely on the shoulders of the American command. If Patton succeeded, the map of the war would change overnight. Bradley reportedly leaned back, silent for several moments, absorbing the implications. This was not the first time Patton had forced his hand. In North Africa, in Sicily, in France, again and again, Patton's aggression had upset carefully laid plans. And again, it had worked. Bradley understood the burden of command well enough to know that anger was pointless now. The crossing had happened. The question was no longer whether Patton should have crossed the Rhine, but whether the rest of the Allied forces could exploit what he had done. What Bradley said next would later be remembered in different ways, retold in memoirs, whispered among officers, and debated by historians. Some claimed he smiled thinly and muttered something close to resignation. Others remembered a sharper edge, a mix of frustration and reluctant admiration. The most commonly repeated version was simple and telling. Well, damn it, George, you did it again. It was not praise. It was not condemnation. It was recognition. Bradley knew Patton well enough to understand the mindset behind the decision. Patton believed momentum was everything. He believed hesitation cost lives. To Patton, the Rhine was not a wall. It was an obstacle begging to be ignored, waiting for permission, waiting for perfect conditions, waiting for everyone else to be ready. These were luxuries Patton believed no real battlefield ever offered. If the enemy was unprepared, you struck. If they were confused, you struck harder. That was Patton's war. Yet Bradley also knew what Patton risked. A failed crossing could have meant isolation, counterattack, and devastating losses. German forces, though battered, were still capable of fierce resistance. A bridgehead without proper support could turn into a death trap. Bradley felt the weight of every soldier's life involved, and that weight made Patton's gamble difficult to forgive, even if it succeeded. As dawn broke on March 23rd, confirmation arrived. Patton's bridgehead was holding. Engineers were already expanding crossings. Armor was moving east. German resistance was scattered and disorganized. The feared counterattack did not materialize. The Rhine, long mythologized as Germany's final shield, had been breached almost casually. In that moment, Bradley understood something profound. The war in Europe was effectively over. Not officially, not yet, but strategically. Privately, Bradley admitted that Patton's action forced everyone else to move faster. It shattered complacency. It denied the Germans time to regroup, and it ensured that no single Allied army would monopolize the final drive into Germany. Bradley may not have approved of Patton's methods, but he could not deny the results. The crossing accelerated. The collapse of the Third Reich in ways no staff meeting ever could. Still, Bradley did not rush to publicly praise Patton. Discipline mattered. Precedent mattered. If commanders began acting independently without regard for higher authority, the entire Allied command structure could fracture. Bradley's role was to maintain order, even when chaos produced success. He supported Patton's crossing after the fact, ensured reinforcements flowed, and quietly absorbed the political risk himself. That night, Bradley wrote in his diary with characteristic restraint. He did not celebrate. He did not rant. He recorded events, measured outcomes, and acknowledged reality. Patton had crossed the Rhine without orders, and it had worked. History would remember the boldness. Bradley would remember the responsibility. As word spread through the ranks, soldiers sensed the shift. The river that had loomed so large in their minds was now behind them. Morale surged. Confidence returned. For many, Patton's audacity became a symbol that the end was near. For others, it was simply another reminder that war often rewards those willing to gamble everything. But the story did not end with the crossing. The consequences of Patton's decision would echo through the final weeks of the war, strain relationships at the highest levels, and shape how both men would be remembered. Bradley would soon face pressure from allies, from superiors, and from history itself to define where discipline ended and genius began. And as the Third Army pushed deeper into Germany, one truth became impossible to ignore. George Patton had once again forced the war forward faster than anyone planned. Whether Bradley liked it or not, the Rhine crossing without orders had become one of the defining moments of the European campaign. By the time the sun fully rose over the eastern bank of the Rhine, the reality of what George Patton had done could no longer be confined to a single headquarters or a few startled staff officers. Reports flowed upward with growing urgency. Bridges were being expanded. German resistance was weaker than expected. Patton's columns were already pushing deeper, faster, farther than anyone had planned. What had begun as an unauthorized gamble was rapidly becoming an operational fact that the entire Allied command had to adapt to. For Omar Bradley, this was the most difficult kind of moment a commander could face, not a defeat, not a clear victory, but a success achieved through disobedience. As commander of the 12th Army Group, Bradley was responsible not just for Patton's Third Army, but for the cohesion and discipline of the largest American force ever assembled. He understood that if Patton were openly reprimanded, it could damage momentum and morale. But if Patton were openly praised, it could undermine the very chain of command that held the Allied armies together. Bradley's staff waited for his reaction. Some expected an outburst. Others expected a cold, formal reprimand. Instead, Bradley did what he always did in moments of pressure. He grew quieter. Those close to him later recalled that he studied the maps for a long time, tracing Patton's advance with his finger, not as a critic, but as a man calculating consequences. Every mile gained was a mile that had to be supplied. Every bridgehead expanded was another promise that American soldiers would be committed deeper into enemy territory. Privately, Bradley wrestled with a truth he rarely voiced aloud. Patton had been right about momentum. The Germans had been caught off guard. Their defensive plans for the Rhine had assumed time to regroup, time to counterattack, time to exploit Allied caution. Patton had stolen that time. Bradley knew that no amount of perfectly written orders could replicate the shock Patton had delivered by simply refusing to wait. Yet Bradley also knew that Patton's instincts could not be allowed to become doctrine. For every bold success, there was the potential for catastrophic failure. Bradley had seen enough war to know that. Luck and brilliance often looked identical until they didn't. And Patton, for all his genius, relied heavily on instinct, confidence, and an almost mystical belief in destiny. Bradley believed war should never depend on destiny alone. As word of the crossing reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, the pressure on Bradley intensified. Eisenhower trusted Bradley deeply, but he also understood Patton's value. The question now was not whether Patton had broken the rules, but whether stopping him, or even slowing him, would do more harm than good. Eisenhower's response, measured and strategic, left Bradley with little room to maneuver. The crossing would be supported. The advance would continue. The war demanded it. Bradley later admitted, in guarded language, that this was one of the moments when leadership meant swallowing personal judgment for the sake of the larger mission. He did not like how Patton had acted, but he recognized that correcting Patton publicly could fracture unity at a critical stage. Instead, Bradley chose a path that defined much of his command style. He absorbed the risk himself and let the momentum carry forward. Behind closed doors, however, Bradley's frustration was real. He confided to trusted officers that Patton made his job harder precisely because he was so effective. A reckless general who failed could be dismissed. A reckless general who succeeded became untouchable. Patton's Rhine crossing elevated him once again into that dangerous category, too valuable to restrain, too unpredictable to fully trust. Among the soldiers, the story took on a life of its own. To the men of the Third Army, Patton had once again proven that he was unstoppable. To many infantrymen slogging through mud and shellfire, Patton's boldness felt like a promise that the war would end sooner. But among senior officers, the mood was more complex. They understood that Patton's success forced everyone else to accelerate their own operations, sometimes before they felt fully ready. Bradley watched as the pace of the war quickened almost uncontrollably. The Rhine crossing did not just open a path into Germany, it triggered a cascade. Supply lines stretched. Command decisions had to be made faster. Mistakes carried greater consequences. Bradley felt the strain of managing a war that was now moving at Patton's speed, not the planners. In quiet moments, Bradley reflected on the irony of it all. For years, he had worked to keep Patton in check, to channel his aggression into something useful without letting it burn everything around it. And now, at the very moment when caution still mattered, Patton had acted completely on his own and been proven right by events. Bradley could not help but wonder whether history favored men like Patton more than men like himself. Yet Bradley also saw what others missed. He saw the exhaustion behind the speed. He saw units racing forward with little rest. He saw young officers struggling to keep control of rapidly moving formations. He knew that boldness had a cost, even when it worked. And he knew that when the war ended, those costs would not be measured in maps or headlines, but in memories that never faded. In later years, Bradley would speak of the Rhine crossing with careful neutrality. He never denied Patton's achievement, but he always framed it as part of a larger system, one that required discipline, cooperation, and shared responsibility. He refused to let Patton's legend eclipse the reality that thousands of unnamed soldiers made that crossing possible. As the Third Army surged eastward, Bradley understood that the final phase of the war had begun not with a formal order, but with a single act of defiance. Patton had forced the issue, and now the Allies were committed to a rapid, relentless push that would leave little room for second thoughts. And still, the question lingered in Bradley's mind. A question he would never fully answer aloud. If Patton had failed at the Rhine, would history remember him as a hero or a liability? The answer no longer mattered. The river was behind them. Germany lay open ahead. What remained was the reckoning between control and chaos, obedience and instinct, and between two generals whose partnership would forever shape how the war in Europe was won. By April of 1945, the war in Europe was no longer a question of if, but when. German resistance collapsed unevenly, sometimes fierce, sometimes non-existent, as Allied armies surged eastward through a landscape already shattered by years of conflict. The Rhine, once feared as an unbreakable barrier, had faded into memory behind the advancing columns. For Omar Bradley, however, the memory of that unauthorized crossing did not fade. It lingered quietly, shaping how he interpreted everything that followed. Bradley watched as Patton's Third Army continued to drive forward with relentless energy. Town after town fell in rapid succession. Prisoners poured in by the thousands. The speed of the advance was staggering, even to those accustomed to Patton's style. Yet Bradley noticed something else as well, a subtle shift in the war's tone. It was no longer about maneuvering against a coherent enemy front. It was about managing collapse, preventing chaos, and ensuring that victory did not dissolve into disorder. In this final phase, Bradley's role became less visible but more demanding. While Patton captured headlines, Bradley coordinated vast movements across multiple armies, balancing supply, logistics, and political realities. He understood that the end of a war was often more dangerous than its beginning. Discipline could erode, emotions could overwhelm judgment, and bold commanders, emboldened by success, could push too far. Patton, for his part, felt vindicated. The Rhine crossing had confirmed everything he believed about war, that speed saved lives, that hesitation invited disaster, and that opportunity favored the bold. To Patton, the criticism he had received earlier in the war now seemed irrelevant. He believed history would prove him right, and in many ways, it already had. Bradley, however, measured success differently. He measured it not only by ground gained, but by lives preserved and stability maintained. In private reflections, Bradley admitted that Patton's crossing shortened the war, but he also believed that shortening a war did not excuse ignoring authority. The paradox troubled him deeply. How could a commander be both wrong in method and right in outcome? After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the noise of war gave way to silence, and silence gave way to reflection. It was only then, away from the pressure of immediate decisions, that Bradley allowed himself to fully examine what Patton had done at the Rhine. In conversations with close associates, Bradley spoke with unusual candor. He acknowledged that Patton's instinct had been flawless in that moment. The Germans were unprepared. The opportunity was real, and waiting would have squandered it. Yet Bradley also made a confession rarely quoted. He said that Patton frightened him, not because he was reckless, but because he was often right. A commander who succeeded despite defying orders challenged the very foundations of military structure. Bradley believed that an army could not function if every general followed his own instincts, no matter how brilliant. Patton was the exception, not the rule, and exceptions were dangerous to glorify. When Bradley later wrote his memoirs, his words were careful, even restrained. He praised Patton's energy and courage, but he never romanticized the Rhine crossing as an act of rebellion. Instead, he framed it as a convergence of circumstance, skill, and timing. Between the lines, however, readers could sense something deeper, a grudging respect tempered by an unshakable belief in discipline. In one private remark, Bradley reportedly summarized his feelings in a sentence that revealed both admiration and unease. George won battles I never would have risked, and he was right to do it. It was as close as Bradley ever came to fully endorsing Patton's methods. Not approval, but acceptance. Not celebration, but acknowledgement. History would ultimately judge Patton kindly for the Rhine crossing. It became a symbol of audacity, a moment when boldness accelerated the collapse of Nazi Germany. But Bradley understood that history often simplified what were complicated. It remembered daring acts and dramatic personalities, not the quiet decisions that prevented catastrophe. Bradley accepted that his own role would never inspire legends in the same way. As years passed and memories softened, Bradley's view of Patton grew more generous. He came to believe that the Allied victory required both kinds of leaders, the careful and the reckless, the planners and the gamblers. The Rhine crossing, in hindsight, was not a failure of discipline, but a reminder that war was fought by humans, not machines. In the end, what Bradley said about Patton's unauthorized crossing mattered less than what he felt. He felt relief that it succeeded. He felt frustration that it bypassed authority. And above all, he felt the weight of knowing that victory sometimes depended on men willing to break the rules when the moment demanded it. George Patton crossed the Rhine without orders and forced history to keep up with him. Omar Bradley did not celebrate it, but he carried its lesson for the rest of his life. That leadership was not about being right all the time, but about recognizing when someone else was. right, and having the courage to accept it. And so the river remained behind them, silent and forgotten, while the judgment of history flowed on, shaped forever by one night, one decision, and two very different generals.